This video discusses sensitive topics related to abuse. Listener discretion is advised.
I always felt like hiding in plain sight was the best way to keep a secret. And I had something that I didn't want anybody to know about.
You know, if we had a fourth grade math teacher who spoke to the students the way that a coach speaks to students on the field, they would be fired on the spot.
They know that something may be inappropriate or something that doesn't sit well with them happened, but honestly, very rarely are they able to label it as trauma, as abuse, as what it was.
I'm Caroline Culbertson, and I am here today with 3 subject experts to unpack the themes of the PSA that we have just watched. Margaret, you are a 3-time Olympic medalist, world-class swimmer, and during the height of a lot of your athletic achievement in your 20s, you first went public with this information that you had experienced abuse at the hands of a childhood friend's father from ages 5 to 7 years old. And your story that you've spoken so beautifully and openly about has really highlighted for me the ability that some survivors have to go into this like hyperachievement mode. Outwardly, it looked to everybody probably like you were doing amazing. And that helps us understand that for so many victims of abuse and misconduct, they might be carrying this invisible burden that we cannot see from the outside. I'd love for you to talk at the beginning of this conversation about the toll that burden and carrying that invisible burden had on you before you spoke about it publicly, and why that was not okay for you as a young person, even though to so much of the world, it looked like you were doing okay.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I did not act out in the traditional ways. And I think the best way to sum it up is I always felt like hiding in plain sight was the best way to keep a secret. And I had something that I didn't want anybody to know about. And so in my mind, acting out and having this big reaction, someone was going to question that and they were going to go, what's wrong? And so I felt like if I blended in, if I looked like the perfect kid, if I had good grades, if I did well in sports, no one was going to think that anything was wrong and everything was going to look okay. And so that was sort of where this mindset was of how do you keep something a secret? You blend in. So that was sort of where it started. And then somewhere along the line, I figured out that I call it the pit of despair, but I realized that I had this sort of invisible pit that I had to just keep throwing accomplishments in because I didn't feel good about myself and I didn't feel like I had value. And so, yes, I'm competitive and yes, I am athletically inclined and wanted to do these things, but a lot of my accomplishments were because I would do something and then I expected to feel good. I expected to have this value that I thought I was going to gain, and then it just wasn't happening. And so I just kept throwing accomplishment after accomplishment after accomplishment into this pit. And it was this never-ending pit. It just wasn't filling up. And so, I always joke that a lot of athletes, I think they do some of these things because they want to feel better than people and they want to feel like they're on this high cloud or whatever. And I was doing all of this stuff just so that I could walk into a room and feel like I had value. And I think that's the part that people don't see. So it was my own way of acting out. It's just a lot harder to notice, I think, than the kid who's acting out in class or developing a drug addiction or, doing something that's a little more visible.
You mentioned this kind of pit of despair that you felt. For you, what did that, can you help us understand like what that felt like? Like what was that feeling like sort of like in your daily life? How is that affecting your daily life?
I mean, I think it was such a part of me that I didn't notice it for a long time. And I think the best way to describe it is when I finally did recognize it, I was at a swim meet. I had just performed a time that the average person would look at and think was really amazing. I was already an Olympian. I think I was second in the world that year. And I was devastated, like devastated beyond reason. And it was a reaction that I had had multiple times in my life. And I just thought that's how everybody felt when they didn't swim well or didn't do well on a test. Like I thought everybody just felt like that and thought that they had no value and they were like the lowest person on the planet. And I think having that reaction in a context where a part of my brain realized that actually my time really isn't that bad. It took me having a time that wasn't bad for me to recognize something's not right here. Like maybe my reaction's a bit extreme for the situation. And like I said, I'd had that reaction so frequently that I think it was just a part of my everyday life, that it's a fabric of who you are. And I still have that reaction, right? Like at this point in my life, I recognize it for what it is, but I think that's still my default when something happens. And so it's something that you still have to work on. And now I can kind of talk myself out of it and be like, okay, that's not true, right? Like you have value, people love you, this, that, and the other. But, for a long time, I didn't know that. And so it was just this, I guess, dark place that you think you're all alone in, and you think you're the only one, there. And it's hard.
Yeah. Dr. Kilwein, there's this staggering statistic that over half of athletes experience abuse or harassment at some point in their sporting life, which is just a really shocking statistic that I think has hit me in sort of understanding the context of these conversations. As a psychologist who's working closely with student athletes, talk to me about the emotional and psychological toll that this kind of abuse and misconduct can have on young people.
Absolutely. And Margaret, I think you touched on a lot of these answers here, is that it's unpredictable, that there is no perfect survivor, right? There's no way to predict how someone is going to respond to experiencing abuse, harassment, trauma in their lives. There are some, symptoms, some reactions that we can look at, but really the constellation of all of them is different for each survivor. So some things we've seen in the PSA and heard Margaret describe is things like triggers and intrusive memories and thoughts, right? They may be related to the abuse itself, or you may not understand the root of it. So you may react in these really uncharacteristic ways, or ways that others would think are really out of proportion. And yet they remember, or it's a reminder of something related to that trauma when you were younger. So we call those triggers. Folks also might experience nightmares, memories that just pop up randomly for them. And a lot of that is an internal experience, so not something that people from the outside know that you're experiencing. Some other internal experiences are things like changes in your mood. We might see the sadness, we might see the anxiety, changes in the way that you think. So a lot of our survivors look for explanations of their abuse that unfortunately turn to things like self-blame. Did I do something to deserve this? Was it something that I did? Was I asking for it? It also can make us think differently about people in our lives or the world, that, you can't trust other people, or the world is a dangerous place. And again, a lot of these are internal experiences that the outside observer might not know that you're grappling with. And yet some survivors do experience these more external reactions. So we might see things like difficulty concentrating, or just kind of looking numb, or like you're not present in environments. And then we might see these more extreme reactions, like risky behaviors, substance use, engagement in high-risk activity, that, you look at it from the outside and you might think someone's just rebelling, or they're just like acting in problematic ways. But we know that abuse survivors engage in these efforts to regain control over their lives, to regain some sense of, well, at least I chose that, or I was the one that was able to make that choice, because in the context of abuse, choices are taken away from us. We don't have any control over that situation. And when you haven't yet named that what happened to me is abuse or trauma, it's easier to try and look for control or an explanation or a reason that I asked for it, or I did it, or I put myself in those situations. So we see that a lot with our survivors, especially those that haven't maybe recognized quite yet what happened to them. And the last reaction we'll see a lot with our survivors is this sense of, maybe being irritable, or being on edge, or constantly kind of looking around your corner like something's coming, easily startled, reactions like that someone is just on high alert. Because again, this really unanticipated or unpredictable thing happened to me, and I want to prevent that from happening again. When the reality is, in most of these encounters, the survivors themselves did nothing to ask for it. There's nothing they could have done to prevent it. It's just our brain's way of trying to make sense of what happened and protect ourselves.
Can you do a little bit of education for us and for people who are watching who might not really understand what trauma means? This is a word that we hear a lot now, but I think really understanding what trauma is and sort of how people can experience it differently.
Absolutely. So trauma can mean a lot of things. I think when people hear trauma, they assume PTSD, they assume post-traumatic stress disorder, which then they often assume, military combat, really extreme situations. And yes, all of that is trauma and that is PTSD. We also see amongst PTSD survivors that those who have experienced sexual violence are just as likely to develop something like post-traumatic stress disorder as post-combat war veterans. But the reality is that there are lots of trauma experiences that may not fit perfectly into this definition of PTSD. A lot of folks who maybe haven't had a diagnosis or haven't been able to make sense of that with someone. So trauma does not automatically mean PTSD. It can be any experience that you've had that has a psychological or physical impact on you that is distressing or difficult. And usually that means you have experienced something yourself, some form of abuse, trauma, neglect, harassment. And it sometimes can mean maybe it happened to someone close to you. Maybe you were in the environment when it happened or you learned about it. In the context of sport and what we're talking about here, most often that survivor experienced some level of abuse themselves. Some things unique about sporting environments is we often see things like verbal harassment, controlling behavior, humiliation, manipulation can all be forms of trauma that people don't automatically think PTSD. So yes, molestation, sexual abuse, physical violence are all forms of trauma, but there's these other broader, sometimes ongoing forms of trauma that our athletes experience that people don't always think of as the traditional trauma or abuse. So for years of someone, again, humiliating you, manipulating you, grooming you, even if it doesn't end up being something like physical or sexual abuse later, can have really lasting impacts on our survivor.
Dr. Miles, for a young person who has experienced abuse, and unfortunately sometimes this often can happen multiple times, even by the same aggressor, can you help us understand the way that that is eroding that young person's self-identity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially when we look in the context of athletes, that's such a unique identity and an identity that gets tied to athletes really early on. And so oftentimes, at a young age and when athletes retire, it's like, who am I outside of sport? So when you're within sport and your identity is being eroded, again, how do I make sense of this? This person who is supposed to protect me is the person who holds the expertise and the resources for me to be able to achieve my athletic goals. How do I, reconcile the fact that this person is also harming me? And all of these, being in this trauma response mode is taking away from all of these developmental milestones that a kid is supposed to be experiencing. So when all of your faculties, all of your internal resources are going to, I need to survive, I need to figure out how to manage this, and that can look like a lot of different things, especially in athletes, because what we think or we see as, oh, what a resilient kid. Wow, what a high-performing, high-achieving kid. When in reality, those are trauma responses. So when you're not able to then explore other pieces of your identity or even form those pieces of your identity because you're in survival mode, and that's all that you're, being able to focus on, and wondering too, what does this mean now for my athletic career? If I come forward, how will that change my identity? How will that change, how people perceive me? And then again, what Dr. Kilwein was talking about with self-blame, blaming yourself. What does this say about me? If this happened to me, what have I done to do this? Am I dirty now? I thought it was such a powerful scene when, in the PSA when they were taking a shower, and it's how do I get clean, and how do I get this off of me? How do I, become myself again? So I think those are a lot of the different ways that that abuse can impact your identity.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you bring up this idea that it can actually interfere with a child's development. That's something that, as a parent myself, we think a lot about hitting those developmental milestones. We think a lot about, giving them, instilling a lot of self-confidence in our children when they're young. And it sounds like something like this happening when a child is experiencing abuse, it halts a lot of that because so much of their resources are going to just helping them get by.
Absolutely. And I think especially with, high level athletes, there's a lot of milestones that are missed already. Like a lot of, elite athletes are homeschooled. A lot of elite athletes are missing out on these, normal childhood experiences. And I've noticed when working with some of my student athletes, realizing like, oh, you never actually developed these social skills because you haven't really had the opportunity to do this. You were homeschooled. You've just been in the gym. And so then adding abuse on top of that, it's like, wow, how many developmental milestones am I actually missing?
Yeah. Margaret, I'm wondering if that resonates with you as somebody who experienced abuse young and also was a really elite athlete.
Some of it, yeah. I think the number one thing I was thinking about was with coaches and the PTSD and being tough. So kind of going back a little bit to what she was talking about, not wanting to talk out and not wanting to say things. Like I know I definitely experienced some verbal abuse as an athlete and not wanting to say anything because you would be viewed as not being tough, right? So it's not even about like, will they perceive me as, however, it's just, yeah, I can take it. Like, and so, I mean, that all plays into it. And so it's not always, are you going to look bad or are you doing something to the coach? Do you just want to be perceived as being tough?
What are some of the challenges that you feel that victims face, especially young victims, in being able to verbalize what has happened to them and what their experience was?
That's a great question, and a conversation I have a lot with my athletes that get to the college or even later in life level of they maybe know that something happened to them. They know that something may be inappropriate or something that doesn't sit well with them happened, but honestly, very rarely are they able to label it as trauma, as abuse, as what it was. So a lot of that is providing some education on maybe what parts were violated in the contract of that relationship that made it abuse and made it trauma. So athletes, they like facts, they like, textbook type of things. And so what I often start with is that framework before I even get into the emotional or psychological reactions. It is hard for an athlete to be able to experience their emotions surrounding abuse when they can't even call it what it is. And so some of it is recognizing that a lot of these factors that promote abuse in sport are really normalized in sport environments. So it's really close and intimate contact between athletes and coaches. There's very few other contexts where we would leave a young person alone with a semi-unfamiliar adult, right? And so there's all these aspects. So what I do is I work with athletes to identify, what are the factors that promoted this to happen. And when we can do that, we remove the blame piece, is that you were going about your business, you were trying to be an athlete, you were trusting an adult you should have been able to trust. And at what point was that violated by the adult or the abuser? We talk about grooming a lot, and that's represented in the PSA, is it doesn't start with sexual violence. It doesn't start with abuse or harassment. There's so many other factors that lead up to it that sort of play with the mind of our athletes to convince them that what happened wasn't abuse or that it was okay or that they did say yes. So maybe they allowed certain behavior in advance, like placing a hand on someone's leg, right? Well, you didn't say no then. So in an athlete's mind, they become convinced, okay, then maybe I did invite it by not saying something. And this is the tactic that abusers use. They gradually introduce abuse and harassment into these relationships to dissuade people from telling, to dissuade people from verbalizing. So when I work with these athletes, a lot of that early stage is just recognizing that abuse even took place, recognizing that it wasn't your fault before we can even explore the impact and the toll that abuse has played.
I would love to hear a little bit about how you think that language and putting terms to some of these uncomfortable feelings, the impact that that can have on especially young people and even children that are experiencing abuse.
Yeah, well, a lot of my research has been on emotional abuse specifically within the coach-athlete relationship. And I think, to go back to some of the challenges of athletes even realizing what this is because, like you said, Dr. Kilwein, I mean, it's so normalized in sport. And in fact, it's seen oftentimes as effective coaching. And especially when you have this response of, this high performing, high achieving, when you're doing so well, it's like, well, it must be working then. And, sexual abuse is often really, really, really secretive, but emotional abuse isn't in sport. And it's very wild that, if we had a fourth grade math teacher who spoke to the students the way that a coach speaks to students on the field, they would be fired on the spot. 100%. Like that would absolutely not be okay. And yet we're at a game or a competition, a meet, and you have all of these teammates, all of these parents, all of these coaches who are saying nothing, while these coaches are, sometimes saying these really belittling, humiliating, shaming things. And so what does the athlete learn? This must be okay. Yeah. And so understanding that context that, coaches also they're employed to win. This is their salary, their reputation, and they're not actually trained to nurture and care for a developing child, which is also a really interesting thing. Like you said, not having, in other circumstances, we wouldn't necessarily put a child alone with a person that we don't necessarily know. Whereas like in sport, also we're giving our child to this person who's not trained to actually care for your child. They're trained to win. And this isn't all coaches, but a lot of coaches. And so I think understanding that, and then to go back to language, I think you can't talk about the healing language without talking about the harmful language. And that language really matters when coaches are talking to kids, when people are responding to, somebody reporting abuse. It's like your words matter to these kids. And something that I've noticed when working with my athletes too is, you just follow, athletes and also, other non-athlete clients, but you want to follow their lead. So it's whatever language they feel comfortable with. So if they come out right out the bat and they're like, I was abused by my coach, I'm like, okay, we were abused by our coach. Let's use this language. But if they come out and they're like, absolutely not, because you have a lot of athletes who see that as betrayal. They're like, that would be me betraying my coach. I love my coach. He couldn't do that to me. There's no way she, that could never happen. And so it's like, okay, so that's where we're at. So let's go slowly, and I'm going to follow your lead with, even if they're not comfortable saying this was violence, it's like, oh, this just kind of felt icky. Okay, cool, icky. We can work with that,
Yeah. Margaret, you have shared a little bit about how it was a very close childhood friend of yours that actually helped you identify that something wrong had happened to you. And so again, this idea that having the words to identify, I think it came from an education, some education that happened at your school, that suddenly there was the language existed for you to explore that maybe what had happened to you several years prior was not okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people don't know what happened to them, and they recognize that something was off. They know it didn't feel right, but they maybe are in denial. They trusted this person. They don't have the maturity in my case because I was a kid. And so for whatever reason, they don't connect the dots. And so I had this sexual abuse education in school and was starting to get there and told a friend of mine. And then she was the one that actually put the words together and said, I think you were molested. Wow. And, that was a term that we were using at the time. And so I said, oh, and then she did the right thing, of course, one, by identifying it, and then two, by saying, you need to go home and tell your parents, which in my case were my trusted adults. And so, that education absolutely served the purpose, and giving me the words and I think putting a name to it was very, very important.
Yeah. I'd like to talk about consent. What do we need to understand about the word consent and the idea of consent and the exchange of consent when it comes to young athletes?
Well, I think one thing that's important is, thinking about athletes who are under the age of 18 and also athletes over the age of 18. And then when we're talking specifically about your coach, there's a power imbalance there that there can't be consent because, like I mentioned before too, the coach has all of the power. They have all of the resources, they have the expertise, they have the age, they maybe have other intersecting identities where they have power in larger society that the athlete does not have. And therein of itself, the athlete is not able to consent to a relationship with a coach because of that. I mean, there's so many things that the athlete could lose. There's just so many things clouding judgment and the ability to say, yes, I want this. And then of course, especially athletes under the age of 18, I mean, you can't, because you also aren't fully developed under the age of 18.
With consent, a lot of my work is around creating trauma-informed sport environments, and we have this misconception of consent that it only relates to sex. That consent only applies to sexual behavior, but the reality is that consent applies in so many facets of an athlete's lives. So I often am talking to athletic trainers, strength and conditioning coaches about how do we create cultures of consent with our athletes from a very young age so they don't get confused about what it means. So if you're placing hands on an athlete, especially a young person, at any point in their life, consent is demanded there too. So you're providing medical treatment, you're providing an adjustment on a strength or conditioning movement. Why aren't we asking for consent in those spaces too? And this is one of those contextual factors of sport that from a very young age, we're not asking for consent. We are placing young, intimate bodies in lots of different vulnerable positions, right? There's blood, sweat, tears, right? These are very intimate, both physically and psychologically environments, yet we're restricting conversations of consent to, maybe the one course, the one educational course, or the one conversation, which for me came from a coach, a PE teacher, right? We're not actually providing this accurate training on what consent is, both related to sex, but also our everyday interactions. So what is so key for consent is we need to be talking about this from a very, very young age before it's too late. A lot of these young vulnerable athletes get into these situations, maybe it's with a teammate, another adult, a coach, whatever it might be, and they don't understand that they have a right to be asked for consent. They have a right to give an enthusiastic yes to anything, to a hug, to anything that they want to participate in. So when we get into these older ages, I have so many athletes that come to me at 18, 19, they get to college, and they still don't know what consent means. And because they don't understand what consent means, they don't know that what happened to them was non-consensual. So it really starts with education, and it starts with normalizing a conversation of consent with all facets of life.
I think to go off of that too, oftentimes with athletes, their body becomes separate from their identity because so much about being an athlete is what your body can do, what it can produce, how it can perform. And so I think that just makes the athlete even more vulnerable to abuse because there's this idea that your body doesn't even belong to you. And there's this culture of push through the pain, push through the discomfort, and, put it all past you. And so I think then that can bleed into other experiences and other parts of life too. This idea that your body is an instrument to be used rather than to be experienced.
You get desensitized to abnormal situations really fast. So in swimming, you're in a uniform where you're practically naked from day one, right? As a 5-year-old, I'm in a swimsuit where very little is covered and, you can see just about everything. And for boys, it's even less, right? And so right off the bat, certain uniforms, depending on the sport, leave little to the imagination. Then there's going to be other situations where I tell people all the time, we used to get massages on the pool deck. So you're lying on a pool deck in front of thousands of people, face down, no shirt on, your swimsuit pulled down to your waist, and you don't think anything of that. I mean, sure, you roll over and they put something over you or whatever, but you don't think twice about the fact because you're just getting a massage, right? But a normal person who's not an athlete would be you're doing what, where, in front of who?
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And it's just by the time you're having that done in college as a professional athlete, it's not a big deal. And so you're desensitized, and each sport is going to have examples of that, right? That's just swimming, but each sport is going to have these things where you're desensitized because it's normal, it's culturally acceptable, it's what they have to do to make things work, uniform-based, whatever. And so, yeah, those conversations about consent are even more important because you don't think about your body in the same way. Like I always thought of my body as a machine, right? Like I eat to fuel it, I sleep to fuel it, like I do X, Y, or Z to get things done.
Yeah. In so many ways, what you're saying is you sort of have this, we all have this innate ability to kind of listen to our bodies, but in so many ways, sports kind of desensitize you or sort of take you out of that instinctual listening to your body that like, oh, it's like weird for me when this person sits really close to me, or that something is making me feel icky, like you mentioned earlier. I'm curious, who is responsible for people who are watching this? Who has a responsibility to lead the conversation about consent?
Yeah, that is such a good question. My initial reaction is everybody. Everybody should be talking about consent in some capacity. People should be talking about it at home. They should be talking about it at school, in sport. And what's crucially important is that this, broader education, when we're really going to discuss this at length, is coming from someone who's trained in providing that form of education. So maybe it's a sexual health educator, it's a mental health provider, whatever it might be. I think we should be having these conversations everywhere and all the time, but real education from people who are trained, that they understand the difficulties of understanding consent and obtaining its consent, how many different spaces it applies to, that should be coming from someone who's really trained. Because unfortunately what can happen is it can get confusing, and especially environments like sport where we often skip stages. We skipped trust building, we skip relationship building, and we're expected to do things really quickly with unfamiliar people, right? Sometimes you change a coach in a weekend. If you're on a club team, you might have one coach that weekend and someone else the other. You might be traveling with an unfamiliar adult to travel games, right? We often are asked to skip that building trust and relationship and just assume good intentions. And that's where it's super important that this conversation about consent is happening everywhere and all the time. So there's so many drastically changing environments and people and expectations around athletes that if education about consent is just coming in one context, okay, just sex or just in a primary romantic relationship, how are we supposed to know when consent is violated in all of these different relationships and environments that athletes operate in?
Yeah. Dr. Miles, one of the things that you mentioned earlier is that idea of a power imbalance. And I'd like to come back to that because I think that's really common scenario for people and something that might be poorly understood. Can you talk a little bit more about why a power imbalance, situations where that might exist, and then also why that makes consent not just tricky, but actually, as you said, impossible?
Yeah, I think, there's a lot of spaces where power imbalances exist everywhere. So, in the workspace, in society also. So you have even, intersecting identities, because I think it's important to also acknowledge that all of us sitting here are white passing, at least, and there's a lot of identities that are not represented here who do have less power in society, and then that can be even more exacerbated in sport. There are certain individuals who are less likely to be believed. They're more likely to be dismissed or seen or blamed for the abuse. And this power imbalance with coaches is especially interesting because you don't have really anybody in between. So you have this person who has so much power, and then you have these athletes who don't have any power at all. Whereas, oftentimes in other situations and scenarios, you have, this whole hierarchy up to the person with the most power. But in sport, you don't. And so oftentimes the athlete then feels like, or is actually facing the choice of, okay, do I report this and give up my dream? Or do I continue to tolerate this abuse and continue on, accomplish my dreams? I mean, what an impossible choice, especially for a young person. That is, I can't even imagine that having to make that choice. And so I think that's really where that power imbalance comes into play, is I don't feel like I have a choice. There is no choice here. Oftentimes the coach also has a really great reputation and everybody in the community really likes them. Your parents maybe trust them, your teammates, everyone around is like, oh, they're so great. We love them so much. And that can just feed into this, okay, I must be wrong. Like that, this must be okay. It must be my fault. What am I doing to make this happen? Because this person has, and even just the fact that they're older than you, that's so much power in and of itself right there. Oftentimes there's a gender piece, there can be a racial piece, there can be a sexuality piece, and not really understanding because then if you don't have power in the relationship, you're also not going to have power once you come forward. And so understanding just the repercussions of that too, like, am I going to have the support that I need in order to be able to thrive after this? And unfortunately, the answer is usually no.
Yeah.
And I want to acknowledge that power imbalances exist in sport in so many different ways. We've talked a lot about athlete-coach relationships, but depending on the context and the organization, you've got administrators, you've got staff, you've got support people, you've got the athletes, you've got peers. And so there are opportunities for these power imbalances and ultimately abuse to exist in so many different ways in sport. So we talk a lot about athletes, but we can also see it between different staff members, coaches and administrators. You can see it between administrators and athletes. And so if we talk about factors that are really unique to sport, it's that it is a hierarchical system. There are a lot of people involved in the sport world and wanting success of athletes. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is there are people really focused on money and success and reputation and all of these things that don't lend well to a sexual abuse report. So when it comes to these power imbalances, you also have to think about, sure, you may have been abused by a coach or a peer, whoever it might be, but your reporting structure, who is that? And who are they asked to protect? So a lot of athletes may even have a desire to report, but no, like, who I'm being asked to report to, what is that going to mean? How is it going to impact this broader system? So not only do power imbalances affect and maybe promote abuse from occurring, they really prevent people from using reporting structures if they're not independent, if they're not outside of that primary system.
Yeah. Help me understand how this conversation shifts to when it's maybe student athlete and student athlete, that the abuse is occurring between athletes. We've talked a lot about, somebody who might be a staff member or a coach, that the abuse is happening in that relationship. But what about when it's between students or athletes?
Some similarities and some differences, right? So we can still see really strong power imbalances within teams or across teams, right? So we can think of, what teams in a system, maybe the revenue generating sports, have a little bit more power and people protecting them than some other sports. Within team structures, especially co-ed sports, you can see abuse happen within that. And then survivors are left asking themselves of, how will this threaten the strength and the bond of our team if I share and report? Will coach believe me? Will administrator believe me when they have a relationship with this athlete too? So when we're thinking of, professional, Olympic, college, sport organizations, where again, these environments have a lot of factors that promote these relationships and these violations of consent. And if we don't have full trust in that system to take care of our athletes, then it poses a lot of fear and a lot of questions about, will I be believed? How will they respond? Will they retaliate? Will it threaten my position in this department or on this team? And while, of course, we have a lot of systems that navigate sexual abuse very well, they have good independent reporting structures, they have supports, independent providers you can talk to that maintain your confidentiality, a sports psychologist on staff, sexual health educators. There are still a lot of systems out there that prioritize protecting the system. And when that happens, survivors of abuse, don't come forward. And when they do, and other survivors see how it's managed or how it's respond, then the next survivor, and there will be a next survivor, doesn't want to report themselves.
Yeah. Well, and I've even just to expand on that, I mean, I've had athletes who have, been assaulted by somebody on a more revenue generating team and then, have been, I will not report this. I am scared of what will happen. I absolutely won't do that. And then are forced to, this person is all over campus and they're picture is everywhere and they're on all of the, and so even understanding the power dynamics there of, like you said, these revenue generating sports where, I remember a client, just talking about like, what are they going to do? They're not going to do anything because they're not going to do anything to, hurt this team or to bring this team down.
Do you think that when money enters the picture for athletic organizations or for athletes, that it does change kind of what's at stake in terms of not just what's at stake in terms of reporting, but also the landscape in which abuse can occur?
Absolutely. I think money, a lot of times, it makes it difficult for adults to differentiate their needs from an athlete's needs. I think that money can be really blinding. I think that, like Dr. Kilwein mentioned earlier too, money, there are these people in the system that only are focused on money and success. And that, of course, is going to then impact the power, because money is power also. And so I know now things are shifting a little bit with athletes being able to be paid. But I have wondered to myself, can a child be really talented and not be exploited by adults? And I think that's a really hard question. And there's a lot of adults that need to step in to protect the child for that talented child to not be exploited. And I don't think this is usually not intentional, where adults are like, I'm going to exploit this kid. Sometimes it is. But just having these conversations and normalizing, hey, this is maybe not okay, or asking the kid what they want, or the athlete, the kid, adult, whatever stage the athlete might be in. But I think I think money too, with the more revenue generating sports, that adds a whole other element of secrecy, of silence, and of protecting the people with power and the people who are going to make money.
Yeah. I'm curious how that lands with you as somebody who found a lot of athletic success from a young age, has seen all different sorts of, athletic structures and organizations, been around all sorts of adults that had perhaps differing interests in your athletic success and career. How does that land with you?
I want to say that yes, money plays a role, but I think historically we can look at your average sexual abuse case, and the reality is most people are not finding, success in the justice system. Regardless. You can look at the Catholic Church, for example. Money was not playing a role, and but there was obviously big cover-ups. So I think big organizations are going to have cover-ups if it benefits them in some way, whether money is the driving factor or not. Money is a big driving factor, and so that obviously is going to play a role. I don't think it's the only driving factor. And then again, like I said, unfortunately, I think your average everyday case, I was an average everyday case. My case was thrown out of court. Is it getting better? Yes, but I still think the majority of the time, if it goes to court, it's thrown out of court. If there is a sentence, it's a pat on the back, a very small fine. The average person is not really getting justice, so to speak. So it does complicate things for sure, but I don't think it's necessarily making it worse. Swimming by no means is a money-generating sport, but I would say I was just as passionate and had just as much of a power imbalance as a sport where it is money generating. And I say that mostly because in sports like that, you're not doing it for the money. Up front, it's not about the money. You're doing it for the love of the sport and the love of what you're doing. And you want to go to the Olympics, you want to break world records, you want to do whatever, go to college, whatever your goal is. And I think that's just as powerful, so that imbalance can be just as intense as if it's about money. So again, I agree that money is a huge motivator. I just don't think it's the only one.
Yeah.
And I'm just real quickly, I think that's a really good point, that it's not just financial costs. These institutions have to look at lots of different costs, financial, reputational, performance. And what I've written about at length, and anytime someone's consulting me on this, is the money that you will save, the reputation that you will save, the performance things that you will save by handling this well will always outweigh the financial, reputational costs of a public scandal. And we see this in sport. We see it in every sport organization and industry. When it eventually comes out, and it will, when it eventually comes out, all those moments you thought you were saving money or reputation, or you're going to see that now. Firing coaches, administrators, costs to recruiting, costs to the reputation of your programs and your campus. If that's your bottom line and you care about those costs, then I don't care how or why you handle sexual assault, right? I care that you do. If that's the conversation we need to have with people with different interests of this is an investment, a reputational financial investment to handle these cases well and protect your athletes and respond in appropriate ways, sometimes that shifts the dialogue.
Yeah.
In the PSA that we watched this morning, in this PSA, the situation that we see occurring is called grooming. I would love to do a little bit of education on what grooming is and how it's possible for this process to happen in plain sight without people picking up on it.
Yeah. How I would define grooming is it's sort of the preceptor to abuse or violence happening. It is these sort of micro tactics that abusers use to build trust, build intimacy, build a culture of silence before the abuse occurs. And the tactic or the purpose of grooming is so if and when that abuse does occur, that it won't maybe be viewed as abuse, that the survivor might question, well, did I accept these other behaviors? So often abusers intentionally will engage in these tactics so the young person often, but can be adults as well, will then questions themselves when the abuse comes. Well, I allowed this certain behavior, or I trusted and I cared about this person. I think that's something we've talked about at length is when you're abused by someone that you know and trust, it makes it really confusing and hard to name it as abuse. So what abusers do is they engage in these grooming tactics. They maybe treat you really well. They make you feel like you are special, that you are the chosen one at times. They really make you feel good and like you can trust them and respect them before they get into any territory that's considered abuse. But to me, grooming is abuse. Grooming is a part of it. What we want to do is recognize when grooming is happening and stop it before it ever gets to the place of abuse.
Yeah, I mean, grooming is a systematic breaking down of interpersonal barriers and boundaries. So yeah, like you said, it's micro. It can start out so small. And this is also what then can lead to self-blame and understanding. I really appreciate that you said, grooming is abuse, because if we can look at it through that lens, it's like, then when we're talking to the survivor, it's like, you didn't make this happen. This person, the perpetrator, was making this happen from the very beginning. This was the plan. Then they're really good at what they knew exactly what they were doing, so that you would feel like this, and this has been a part of the plan this entire time.
Couple things. One, it's not hard to figure out what people like, especially with kids, right? What's your favorite color or what's your favorite animal? If you ask them, they will tell you. It's not hard. But it's also not hard with adults. It's really not hard to sit down, meet somebody, and ask them questions. People like to talk about themselves. So it's not hard to find those interest points. But also I think it's really important that sometimes we focus that grooming is yes, it's that process of doing this with the victim or the survivor, but it's the whole community. It's everybody. It's not just the person who's getting abused, because these people wouldn't be successful if they didn't groom those around them, because they wouldn't have access to this person. So it's the entire community. It's everyone around, right? There's a reason why oftentimes, unfortunately, people have this reaction of, there's no way, this couldn't have happened. I worked with this person for 20 years. It's the coach, it's the pastor, it's the teacher, it's the whoever in the community. I've known them for 20 years, right? They have this reaction because nobody likes to feel duped. Nobody wants to feel like they themselves were tricked. So it's a lot easier for me to sit here and go, well, someone couldn't fool me. So therefore, this other person must be lying. This couldn't have happened because, I had my kids over to this person's house and I would have known something. Right? And so it's easier for someone to sit there and say that than to acknowledge, oh my gosh, this person fooled me. And then to take it on a bigger step, look at famous people. When we find out and we read in the media that this famous musician, is facing sexual abuse charges. And then, you have fans go, well, there's no way. I don't know this person. I like their music. I've seen them in interviews. obviously this person is going to present an image to the world because they want to sell records or they want to sell movies or whatever it is that their job is. But we have to remember that's a job. And that's an image that they are presenting. And we don't know this person. And we don't know what goes on behind closed doors. And so again, that's all a part of this grooming, right? This grooming of an audience in a much bigger context. And so that's what predators are doing on a smaller context, right? In the one-on-one. But it's, my parents weren't going to let me go to Hannibal Lecter's house. You know what I mean? Like, if they had for a second guessed that this person was this horrible person, my parents are good people. They were not going to let me go to this person's house. They thought that this was a parent who had kids about the same age as me. They looked at this house and thought, well, this is just a similar family to me. Like, their kids come over to our house. Margaret goes over to their house. Like, it's just another family similar to us, right? And because my parents never in a million years would do something like that, it didn't even occur to them that someone else could do something like that, right? And so it's that whole community that's getting groomed, not just the actual person.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to highlight, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. That the parents or the support adults for a young person who has been groomed, they can also be part of this grooming process.
Well, I think it's important to note that the vast majority of coaches, adults, pastors, teachers do not sexually abuse children, right? I think that's really important to lay out. And so parents, of course, they've always got to wonder and worry about this, but I don't want parents to be in that space of like, anywhere I send my kid, I would say there's always the potential for abuse, right? But it doesn't mean it's inherently going to happen. And sometimes the abuse is at the hands of the parents, right? And so we've just got to recognize that we can't predict these things. They're not always a sure thing. But for parents, like, things you want to be watching out for is changes in behavior of your young person is a really big one. Changes in the dynamic of a relationship between an adult and a child, where they may be spending more time. How do they act when they come home? But I think what's really important for parents is, like, ask your young people questions. Young people, working with young people, you come to realize they know way more than we give them credit for. They understand more than we give them credit for, but no one's asking the questions because we're assuming they don't understand. So be willing to ask your young person, what is your relationship with that person like? What happened there? Did anything feel wrong? If you've already built in these conversations about consent and what is appropriate behavior and what are violations and things you need to tell your parents, it makes it easier for a young person to recognize when it's happening. So it's really key. Like, the impetus to prevent sexual abuse is not on young people. It's not on parents, right? It's on all of us. But those conversations that you can have in the home with your young person can help you and the young person recognize when grooming happens, recognize these signs. Some clear signs that we saw when we watched the PSA video is the grooming, it was the special treatment, right? Like, fist bump, you're doing really good, maybe making you feel special. Now, giving a fist bump to an athlete is not inherently abuse, right? But things to watch out for. And then you've got the small, intimate touching. Maybe you've got the hand on the leg, right? Maybe they're spending more alone time together. Maybe there's more texting involved. That's not appropriate at that age. That's a big one now with social media and the access to phones and texting. Is like, we should be having those conversations with our young people about what is and isn't appropriate conversations to be having with adults. So it's those smaller signs to be watching for, and then being willing to ask the questions, set some boundaries that can ultimately prevent grooming from turning into further abuse.
Dr. Miles, I think, in many ways, this conversation has focused on sexual abuse, but one of the areas of your focus in your research has been emotional abuse between coaches and athletes. If there is something like that at play, does that potentially make an athlete more vulnerable to other types of abuse, to grooming, to sexual abuse, something like that?
I think it can. I don't think there's an easy answer to that necessarily. But oftentimes emotional abuse does precede physical or sexual abuse. And so if that is happening, some of the signs to look out for parents is, okay, are they having closed practices? Are they, closing the blinds? Are they not allowing parents to even come to practice? Like asking these sorts of questions and just paying attention to these things and not blindly trusting the coach. But, one of the reasons that I was so intrigued and interested in emotional abuse is this idea of how rampant it is and how, common and how pervasive it is throughout the entire sporting culture. I mean, it's so wild, and that nobody really is talking about it or stepping in. I mean, when I went to go do my research, I was like, there is hardly anything on this. And part of it is because emotional abuse and emotional violence, psychological violence, it's really hard to define. And so whereas physical abuse and sexual abuse can be easier to define. And emotional abuse is so different for each kid as well. And understanding that doesn't mean that tough coaching is bad. Tough coaching can be great and can be awesome. It's that line and that boundary between tough coaching and emotional abuse, that we need to find that line. We need to be talking about that line. And oftentimes that line is when it crosses over from the athlete's performance and goes into who the athlete is as a person. And so instead of saying, like, do it again, your time wasn't fast enough, or like, you didn't point your toes, turns into, you don't even deserve to be here, and it turns into, this is who you are as a person. And so oftentimes, that's where that line can be found. But then, if you're feeling like, oh, I'm constantly being belittled and shamed and humiliated. I feel like I'm nothing. And I need my coach now to tell me when I do have value, and it feels so good when my coach is like, great job. Like I'm so glad you're on this team. Like that feels so good. And that might be far and few between. It could be common and often, because grooming can look like two different, it can look like, oh, I'm being so nice to you and I'm making you feel special. And it can also look like right off of the bat, I'm using intimidation, and you see younger kids too can look up to older teams and they see the coaches yelling and screaming at the athletes. And so the younger child is going to think that must be what it takes to be on top. And so now I'm prepared for this, but my coach is so special and so well known, and they have all of these medals, and my parents are all excited about me being on this team. That I'm not going to question it. And so that makes it just ripe environment for pushing the boundaries even further when you already don't feel like you have a sense of self. You already don't feel like you have worth. You already, are putting so much into this coach and so much trust. They have so much control. And the environment of sport is obedience. You are silent and obedient, and that is what makes a good athlete, right? To not question the coach. So again, all of those, little pieces, whether subtle or not, are creating this environment where it's really easy to push those boundaries to physical or sexual abuse, and then to get away with it.
I think to add to that, I coach, and a lot of kids are not necessarily being sexually abused or physically abused at home, but they're also getting that verbal and emotional abuse. The number of parents that I have that literally will come and scream at their children while I'm coaching, and I'm like, whoa, hang on a minute. So these kids are having the parents try to relive their glory days, either for the first time or again, maybe, through their children. And the kid may or may not want to be there. Who knows? But I think they're getting this at home. So then if the coach is doing it, they don't realize that that's not okay, because they're seeing this as normal, right? This is just how it is because mom and dad are doing this. And so I think that makes it trickier because there's no differentiation there.
Yeah, and you start to confuse this like yelling and verbal abuse for love, because it's like, it's these people who are taking care of me, providing for me, protecting me, also like putting me in the position to be able to accomplish my, athletic goals. And so must be what love is, or this is, or it's somehow especially young athletes are like, how do I make sense of this? This must be love, right? Because what is the alternative? That the people that are supposed to love and protect me are abusing me? For a young how just like, even when we're talking about other people not believing, like, no, that coach couldn't have done that, or no, that, famous, music artist couldn't have done that. The kid is also thinking, I have to make sense of this because the alternative is just unimaginable and too painful for me to be able to understand or process, especially at this age.
In the aftermath of abuse that does occur in sports, is there any way that we can shift the landscape, or like what would be required for sports to also be where an athlete finds healing? Because I mean, Margaret, you have talked a lot about how important swimming was to you in all of these years that you were sort of carrying this invisible burden. And I think at one point, a particularly strong image that I remember you speaking about was that you could cry into your goggles and nobody would see.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. I think a lot of times people only talk about the bad side of this. They talk about being abused by their coach and the horrible things that can happen. But there also can be a lot of positive. I think my abuse was going on simultaneous to when I was in sports. And I was not abused by a coach. So I would go to my sporting activities. And I also think that had a lot to do with why I guess, didn't act out per se. And I think that's because I had a healthy place to get rid of all of this emotion that I didn't understand, right? I think I felt all of the emotion that was confusing and wanting to act out. I just had a healthy venue for it and a healthy way to get rid of it. And so to the point, like I could cry in my goggles, I could beat up on the water, right? I could just sprint as hard as I wanted every single day and just get rid of my anger and confusion and just emotion, right? And it just was healthy in a healthy manner. So I think that was obviously not by design, but I think that was a very, very healthy outlet. But I also think that, you know, in its own way, I mean, it took me a while, but I think swimming did teach me self-value. I think it did teach me that I can do hard things, you know. It took me, again, a while to figure this out, but at some point in time, I would stand up on the blocks and I would look at the other 7 women I was competing against and I would say, you know what, I am tougher than everybody here. Like, I've survived something. Now, I mean, statistically, obviously, some of those women had probably survived the same thing I'd survived, right? But I didn't know that. And those were the mental games I started to play. And you know, no, this shouldn't have to be a learning lesson, and it shouldn't have to be something that you survive something to become tough. But I always looked at that as a positive. I always, you know, say like, no, you never want to have to survive something. But I personally like knowing that I can. I like knowing that I have that and that I can pull out of my back pocket and go like, all right, like whatever life throws at me, I know I can handle it and I know I can do it. And I think that was something that being an athlete and having that abuse and turning that into a positive through my athletics. I think I could have done it maybe without athletics, but athletics was sort of an easy transition there that helped me, I think, recognize how strong and how tough I am. And so I think I've always used that as a very, very positive thing. And again, like I said, you certainly never want to have to survive something, but I think that's a very important understanding that all survivors have the ability to do and sort of tap into if they're, you know, open to it.
What I love about what you said is like this focus on you overcoming it, because I think a lot of times too people are like, well, I'm grateful to this, you know, perpetrator because I am tougher now, but it's like, it's not about the person, or it's not about, you know, I think especially when it comes to emotional abuse, it's like, no, that made me tougher. But really the focus of that is you, the survivor, you were able to overcome it, not what the coach or the perpetrator did to you, you know? So I really love that. Like focus on you and like what you overcame, you know?
Thank you.
Yeah,
I will give my mom credit on that one. No, actually, honestly, my mom, one thing I think she did amazingly well was through my entire, I guess, recovery, if you will, as a child, we never talked about my abuser ever, right? Like she made a point of, we're never going to say his name. We're never going to talk about him ever again, because her philosophy was, it's not about him. She was like, I have a little girl that I need to get back on track again, and he doesn't matter. Ooh, this is where I get emotional. But I think that was really smart that she made it about me and he didn't matter.
Yeah.
And so I think that in turn, I learned from that, and I learned how to prioritize myself and do that. So I think that was, whether or not she realized how smart that was, I think that was a really smart move on her part.
Yeah, it's your story, not his.
Exactly.
And she probably didn't know this, but in trauma work, like it should be about you. It should be about not letting that person take any more from you than they already have.
Yep.
So that is a conversation I have a lot with my trauma survivors. And again, I work with a lot of folks who are transitioning into college and maybe just naming for the first time that abuse when they were younger happened. And it is a lot about the perpetrator. Well, he was a good coach. Well, he also gave these things, right? And it's not about that person. It's about you and your own healing journey. And what sport can provide that is so unique is the opportunity for corrective experiences in your life. It is an environment that has so much change, so many transitions, which can be challenging, right? But at the same time, you often have more than one coach. You have more than one sport parent around. You have more teammates, right? So what can be really healing about sport is within the context of those new relationships, they can show you this is what it's like to be able to trust an adult, to be able to trust a teammate, for people to believe you and look out for you and treat you in a different way, not look at you differently because you've survived abuse in sport. And so sport itself creates an environment that can be really, really healing or re-traumatizing based on who's in that environment, what kind of relationships do you build. It also gives you an opportunity to reclaim some control over your life, that it's, again, no longer about the abuse or that person who abused you, but now I have a sense of control. I can reclaim that. I can create a new narrative for myself despite what happened to me. And some of those factors are really unique to environments like sport that gives you the opportunity to rewrite your story, recreate these bonds and relationships in sport.
I would agree, 100%.
And I think for like people watching too, you know, parents or administrators, coaches who are wondering like, okay, what can I do? Model it, you know, like create these corrective experiences, you know, model consent as a parent. Say, is it okay if I hug you when you see somebody? I mean, to be able to make it so that it's normal for a child to say, no, I don't like that. Or yeah, I do want to hug. And same thing with coaches, you know, to model, you know, boundaries, and so that these corrective experiences are possible. And that's where healing can happen.
And a way to do that, a lot of my work, again, is having these conversations about how does everyone have a shared responsibility in creating trauma-informed environments in sport. And the first thing, my opening line for coaches, administrators, athletic trainers, strength and conditioning, whoever it might be, is you should assume that your athletes have trauma.
Yeah.
You should assume that on your field, on your court, in your weight room, in your athletic training room, that athletes in that environment have experienced trauma. So we need to take away this abstract idea that, you know, if everyone is high performing and resilient, it's probably because they haven't experienced anything tough in their life. And sometimes it's the opposite. And that's why they are the way that they are. So you should assume from the get-go that people have experienced trauma and then lead from there.
At the end of this PSA, we see this scene where the friend comes in and she interrupts this moment where the coach is making an inappropriate advance on the student athlete. And I'm wondering what you see the gap is, what we need to build up in our schools, on our teams, in our universities, in our systems to make that situation more feasible than it is today.
Yeah. I love that question because there's still this idea that the conversation about sexual violence prevention is had over here. And it's reserved for the sexual health educators, it's reserved for the sports psychologists, when the abuse is happening over here, right? So these folks often come in and, you know, we do our best to prevent, we often play a role in response, but the reality is those folks who are very well trained in recognizing signs of abuse and grooming are not often the people right on the field. So the responsibility is how do we train and educate everyone involved in the sport environment to recognize and step in these signs. So there's some amazing bystander intervention programs and trainings that are gaining popularity in sport. This education should be going to the teammates, no matter how young they are. There is age developmentally appropriate training on these kind of things, to parents, to coaches, to teachers, to fans, right? Like no one is immune from these things happening in their presence. So it's bringing the conversations that the educators and the psychologists are happening over here to the folks that are in the best position to intervene, which we know from decades of research with athletes that who they disclose their abuse to first is usually a peer. It's usually a teammate. Sometimes it's a parent next, right? But the doctor is often the last person to know. So why are they the ones responsible for stepping in when it's all these other people in that environment that could step in first? So have the conversation, offer the training.
Yeah, I mean, that last scene gave me chills watching it, this idea of this, alternate reality that could have taken place. And I think it's important to also note that it is not the responsibility of teammates to prevent these things from happening. It's just the power of, being able to step in during times. And I think bystander intervention, I'm glad you brought that up. It doesn't always look like saying something really loud and dramatic in the moment. Bystander intervention can be a teammate going up to another teammate saying, that didn't feel right, because what is that? That creates trust, that creates validation, so that this athlete then later on feels safe and comfortable going to that person saying, hey, remember when you said that you didn't think that was okay? Like, this other thing happened too, and I didn't feel like it was okay. What do you think? And so that's what bystander intervention can look like as well. It doesn't have to be, in the moment, the athlete stands up for the other athlete, because that's not always safe. That's not always something that's, practical for the athlete to do.
Yeah. In closing this conversation, and this has been amazing, I'd like to start with you, Margaret, but I'd like for everyone to just share, if there's one thing that people watching could take home, a message of what they can do, the role that they play, how they can empower themselves, how they can empower others, what would you leave our viewers with?
Oh, man. I think having the conversations and being an open ear, right? You never know what somebody's been through one way or the other. And I think being that safe space, being, like I said, being open, being willing to listen, being open-minded, but just providing a safe space. And that doesn't have to look like walking around being like, hi, I'm safe, you can talk to me, right? Like, I think sometimes people think that that's what that means, and it doesn't. I think it's just making yourself available so that if somebody does need to come talk to you, they can. And then also, allowing them to talk, right? I think sometimes having this violent reaction, that's going to shut somebody down. And so it's letting them talk, letting them say what they need to say. And again, having those conversations, like if you're a parent, or again, the safe adult, like having those conversations leading up to, something bad happening, so that they know that they can talk to you. I think that was something my parents did well, was there were many conversations long before I disclosed to my parents, where my parents basically had told me that I could come to them with anything, so that when I needed to come to them, I could. And it never occurred to me that I couldn't, right? When my friend said, you should go tell your parents, I was like, you're right, I should. Like, why didn't I think of that on my own, So I think it's just kind of setting the stage for that, and that you don't have to be a parent to do that. You can be the coach, you can be the friend, you can be whoever. And while we should all have formal training, you don't have to. You can just be a good friend. You can just listen. You can just, figure out after the fact what to do, right? Like, we have this wonderful thing called the internet now that has a lot of resources that we didn't have, when I was growing up. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that, while it's wonderful to have training, you can get a lot of stuff after the fact and just be a good ear in the moment.
Yeah, I love that, because I think so often we think, well, I don't have the tools, or I don't have the training, so there's no way that I can actually properly do this. And that's a really empowering message, I think, for people to understand that setting the stage for somebody to feel safe with you and to come to you, it happens. That work starts long before anything bad ever happens, and hopefully nothing bad ever does.
Exactly.
And that it can also look small. It doesn't have to be a big, grand gesture, but it can also start small.
Yeah.
Dr. Miles, what would you say?
Building off of what Margaret said, I think the initial response when someone does disclose should be, I believe you. And that makes me emotional, but like, there's so much power in that. And there's even more power in saying, I don't believe you, oftentimes. And so in that moment when someone discloses, it's not your responsibility to investigate and figure out what's true and what's not true. In that moment, it's your responsibility to just be there and to say, what do you need right now? Rather than, because it's really easy, and I can also get into the mode of wanting to fix or wanting to make everything okay, when really what I think fixing would actually be not what the person, needs or wants. And so to ask the person who came forward, hey, what do you need right now? Do you need me to just be here? Because I can just be here. And to not push for details, because that can also be re-traumatizing, and to just go at the pace of the survivor. And if, that survivor chooses to share their story, that is a gift and an honor. But to really just have patience and grace and to understand trauma just looks so different for so many people. I mean, it can be then 20 years, realizing and starting to process abuse. And so it's just like a lot of grace there for that person.
Yeah, I want to reinforce that message of believe survivors first. There will be room for questions and help and investigations and all of these things that come next, but believe survivors first. The other thing I would say is, the responsibility for preventing sexual violence rests on the perpetrators. So that responsibility to truly prevent sexual violence in sport lands on perpetrators of abuse not perpetrating. And at the same time, the responsibility to create trauma-informed sports environments so these things don't happen and these abusers aren't invited in those spaces, that is a shared responsibility. So this conversation can quickly turn into like, well, you should be preventing abuse, their parents are responsible, and that is not what any of us are saying. We're saying there are aspects of sport that everyone has a responsibility in making sure is safe for our athletes. And the last thing I would say, I think, to survivors is it's never too late to share your story. I think you're a perfect example of that it is never too late to heal. It's never too late to reclaim your story. And so for anyone who's maybe listening and sitting there and recognizing, even from this conversation, because it happens this way for a lot of people, you might be sitting there recognizing Margaret's story resonated with me, or something they described here is similar to what I experienced, and I want survivors to know that then it probably is what it is, right? And there is someone who's willing to help you make sense of that and be able to share your story in a way that makes sense for you.
Margaret, Dr. Miles, Dr. Kilwein, thank you all so much. This is an amazing conversation, a real gift to share this space with you, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.